Okay. Right. Good day, everybody. It's 10:03 in Brazil, 10:03 a.m. in Brazil. I'm Professor Luciane Sturm, speaking from Passo Fundo, Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil. This is the 8th week knowledge of the University of Passo Fundo, our UPF. This is an event held annually at UPF, with the participation of the UPF academic community, students, faculty, and staff, and the community in general. The main goal is to bring together issues of graduate, research, postgraduate, and extension practices. The thematic of this year event is the transversality of science, technology, and innovation in solving global problems. And we are very glad to have three great names of the educational area to discuss with us the critical education in the global era. We thank you very much to have accepted our invitation. And I was talking to them, to our guests here, that this web conference is very important for this event because it is the first international web conference that we have with the participation of three important names of this area, as I mentioned, and the first conference that we will have all in English and with researchers from different continents, because we have the representation of Africa and America. We will have the opportunity to listen to these three different perspectives on the topic of critical education. First, we will talk Dean Julian Vasquez-Heilig from the USA. Second, we are going to listen to Dr. Lekete Makalela from South Africa. And third, the well-known in applied linguistics area here in Brazil, our friend, Dr. Kleber Aparecido Silva. So to start, I will introduce Dr. Heilig, and of course, it's going to be a summary of his wonderful profile and wonderful curriculum. Then I will be very briefly because we want to listen to them as soon as possible. So Dean Julian Vasquez-Heilig leads nearly 3,000 students, staff, and faculty as the Dean of the University of Kentucky College of Education. He is an award-winning leader, teacher, and researcher. He has a Pac-12 and Big Ten academic background and has led in the Dean Department Program Center as an association settings in the Big 12 and the nation's largest four-year public university system. His research and practice has been primarily focused on Q212 education curriculum, policy and leadership that impacts quality and innovation. He has authored lots of publications and spoken at hundreds of events in different countries. Dr. Vasquez-Heilig has also served as a volunteer education policy advisor and provided input for presidential and lots of campaigns. He has volunteered expertise and served in advisory roles for higher education, government, schools, foundations, civil rights organizations, and community advocacy nonprofits. Dr. Vasquez-Heilig received his PhD in educational administration and policy analysis, and a master's degree in sociology from Stanford University. He also earned a master's in higher education and a bachelor's degree in history and psychology from the University of Michigan. So, welcome, Dr. Vasquez Heilig. It's really a pleasure to be here, and we thank you very much to be with us. So, it's your time and your turn.
Thank you so much. So glad to join you virtually this morning. Thank you for the introduction. It made me tired and feel like I need to take a nap. That sounded like quite a bit. So thank you so much. Let me go ahead and put my presentation screen on here. Hopefully that should work for us. Just a moment here. Let's see. Okay. All right. So can you all see that? Is it all set? Is it okay?
Yes,
all right. So,
yes, it's okay.
Yes? Okay, great. So today I want to talk about educational inequality, education reforms, and how we do work that is community-based and community engaged, and how also we as academics can hold ourselves accountable to those values in the work that we do in our profession. Feel free to tweet at me during this talk, Professor JVH. Would love to hear from you. If you have questions after the talk, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or email. Thank you again for having me join you. In the United States, we are always respectful and recognize that we live on indigenous land. And where I live, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Delaware, the Mesopotamia, the Shawnee, Wyandot, and Uchi tribes, the indigenous people, lived on this land where I live and where the University of Kentucky is. Now, the elephant in the room, not just in the United States, but worldwide, is that there are vast inequalities between neighborhoods, between historically marginalized communities. It's the elephant in the room. The United States is no different from other countries. In 2011, when the Opportunity to Learn Coalition first began its work, the statistics on poverty in the United States were shocking, and they still are to this day. But a majority of public school children in 17 of the states in the US, a third were low-income students. So that means that in more than a third of states, the majority of the students were poor. Now, what does this inequity in our country mean? What does it mean in other countries? Where you have low funding levels, you have less competitive teacher wages. A nearby state, for example, Indiana, ranks in the bottom quintile nationally for what they pay teachers. And in the research shows, in the place where teachers have less stability, less pay, that you have much higher turnover. The research also says the places where you have much higher turnover are the schools that serve historically marginalized communities. These things are connected together. One report found that these unfair funding patterns are consistent across indicators, meaning that students with unfair school funding are likely to experience a deprivation, a lack of resources critical for their success in school. Clearly in the United States and elsewhere, this is on purpose. This is not by mistake. One of the interesting conversations, and Noam Chomsky, and many of you probably know his work, he's here at the University of Arizona now. He has an interesting film on Netflix. I don't know how many of you watch Netflix, but there's a lot of interesting films there, and one of them is called Requiem for the American Dream. And in this film, he talks about how powerful people have focused on less democracy and education reform instead of less inequality. And that's the theme that I would like to take up with you for the next couple of minutes. So instead of public policy, instead of education policy more specifically, that focuses on reducing inequality in schools, you have policymakers and other powerful people focusing on how can we create less democracy in the work that we do. You see this in Brazil and other countries too. So here's a couple of examples from our country, and I think some of them will probably ring true, and I try to also sprinkle in some of the pieces of education policy conversations in Brazil here too. So as you see in Chile and as you see in Sweden and many other countries, there's been this drive, this push towards school choice or market-based reforms, such as vouchers like you see in Chile, charter schools, and other neoliberal reforms. In our country, I have been studying Teach for America for almost 15 years. Teach for America has been exported around the world in what they call Teach for All. Of course, it also is in Brazil, and I did an entire podcast about Teach for Brazil, and it's on iTunes. Just go to Truth for America, and there's a specific podcast about Brazil. So this has been the focus in education reform for some time, instead of addressing economic inequality. Of course, with COVID, we see a lot of movement towards other neoliberal reforms. Charter schools have been funded extensively with federal funds. You see a reduction in teacher quality requirements, etc. And there's that old saying, let no disaster go to waste. And so we, I think, as researchers have to carefully monitor these government decisions in the midst of COVID, because a lot of times we're seeing that these decisions are being made not necessarily due to COVID constraints, but rather due to neoliberal ideology. And the prime example of this in the United States was after Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana and New Orleans. Many of you have probably heard of this. They took all of the schools after that disaster and turned them into charter schools. There are very few public schools left. So you will have, and 10 years on, the education reformers that adopted charter schools have not improved the situation for children in an appreciable way. I think we also need to be paying very careful attention in education reform to executive actions and also state-based political actions. So we had Trump for some time, and now you have Bolsonaro, or Bozo, I hear he's called, who are perpetrating different types of executive and state-based actions. So, for example, in the United States, critical race theory, which many of you may be aware of, is under attack in some quarters, especially in conversations about social studies curriculum. But quite frankly, critical race theory is a theory that we teach in higher education to conduct research as a part of conceptual frameworks. You're not going to see this in kindergarten. So the reason why we see this conversation about critical race theory is because after we experienced the George Floyd murder at the hands of police officers, the issue arose in the United States in a watershed way. However, CRT is being used as a way to stop conversations about inequality, stop conversations about racism. It even is being used to change why the Civil War occurred in the United States back more than 150 years ago, I think we're at this point. And so you see a variety of executive and state-based political actions targeting marginalized communities based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. And my understanding is that you see those same sorts of approaches right now in Brazil and other countries. Now, you know, for the past several years, you have been talking about the BNCC. Now, that is an outgrowth of what was called the systemic reform movement in the United States that started in the early 1990s. And we've had this 30-year education reform paradigm. Of course, Common Core is pretty new, but standards goes all the way back. And actually, Common Core, which is similar to your BNCC, is actually not very popular in the United States anymore. In fact, this entire paradigm of a aligned curriculum that's based on standards, that's related to high-stakes tests, that then has accountability ratings, is much less popular than it was 15 years ago, because that reform paradigm promised that we would close all achievement gaps by 2014. That was George W. Bush's promise in the United States. And of course, that did not happen. And so there's a lot of people questioning that BNCC, standards accountability testing paradigm, because it never worked. In fact, when I was in Texas, before I went to graduate school at Stanford, the whole paradigm that you saw in the United States was based in what Texas was doing, because Texas had said it had had an education miracle. But in fact, it had never had an education miracle. And so this entire paradigm of standards and Common Core curriculum and all those other things that go with them never had a empirical foundation of efficacy. And then you see in this era also an escalation of inequality between schools, vast resource disparities. For example, in the United States, there's a $23 billion disparity between schools that serve predominantly students of color and schools that serve predominantly white students. And this is a resource disparity issue that you see in Brazil and other countries, driven and controlled by policymakers and powerful people. I want to invite you to also check out my blog. I talk more extensively about many of these topics, cloaking inequity. It's had more than 1 million readers in almost 200 countries, cloaking inequity. I invite you to go there. I've been talking quite a bit about race in the curriculum recently. But there are some alternatives. And there are some alternatives to thinking about educational change that focused instead on community. So my work over the past 10 years has been, how do we mobilize local education reform? Because this neoliberal approach to education that you see in Brazil and Sweden and many other countries, Chile, this dominant paradigm of top-down private control and privatization persists despite vocal oppositions from communities. And these top-down models ostracize communities and community-engaged work. But there's quite a bit of research that support these effective models of community engagement in educational change. And so this community organizing has emerged as a powerful form of engagement. So what does this mean in practice? You know, sometimes we talk, as academics, we talk about the theory, but I want to talk about some very specific things. But the focus, the meta, is a community voice versus external actor in education reform, educational change. And so here is just a quick set of items. So on the left, you have what's happened in the United States. And so, for example, in Brazil, you have Teach for All. Here it's called Teach for America. Again, it's an American export, better left on the shelf. And so on the left, you see this top-down private control and less democratic approach, small d, to education. On the right, you have a set of community-based, democratically controlled approaches to doing the same thing. So for every neoliberal educational change idea, there's a community-based, democratically controlled alternative. And I won't go into all of these because I know I only have 20 minutes, and I want to make sure that the other folks have their time too. And now I want to talk a little bit about us and the decisions that we make as academics, the decisions that we make as educational leaders. And I really truly believe that the work that we do as educational leaders, the work that I do as a dean, as a civil rights leader, and serving on boards and all the other things that I do, is that work must be dialogic. We must do it dialogically, in the manner or nature of a dialogue. And one of your preeminent scholars, of course, Paulo, leaders who do not act dialogically but insist on imposing their decisions do not organize the people. They manipulate them. They do not liberate, nor are they liberated. They oppress. This is what we should demand of ourselves as academics, as educational leaders, as people who are influential in our society. And I believe that we can do that by making sure that we engage with the public and get noticed and build momentum with communities. So we must prioritize relationships that lead to initiatives with educational leaders, with unions, with civil rights organizations, and other educational stakeholders. It was such an honor to interact with the educational leaders from Brazil at the International Congress before COVID. And I know that they are winning some of their fights. And so congratulations to them. But how do we do this work as faculty, as university professors? We must hold ourselves accountable to choose innovative leaders. And that means that we must choose politicians, superintendents, deans, department chairs that are community engaged, community relevant, transformative, and dialogic. That's on us to make sure that that happens as influential members of society, as influential members in our universities. And we must commit to democracy in this work, in educational change. And it must be community-based and community engaged. There at rallies here in the United States, we often say the people united will never be defeated. We must take our research to action. We must make our research available directly to communities. And as influential people in your communities, we can strategically guide consensus in our field to invest in research in low-income communities and people of color and the neighborhoods that they live in, while avoiding the profiteering and privatization that has gone hand in hand with neoliberalism and educational change. We must mobilize knowledge in social, new and traditional media for equity and community-based education reform. Now, many of you have probably heard about the January 6th riot at the Capitol. Many of you have probably also heard about the Black Lives Movement here in the United States. One interesting thing that both of those situations have in common is that they were organized on social media. Social media now allows us to reach all audiences and cross all borders. I had no idea that my blog, Cloaking Equity, would be read in every country in South America. I still don't know why that's the case, but it's the case. In almost every country in Africa and most of the countries in Europe. It's amazing that my blog about educational equity and justice would cross all borders. And that's the kind of work that we as academics have to do. I actually have a whole talk about how we develop social and new media ecologies for our research and for our scholarship and for the knowledge creation process. How do we do public scholarship in social media? And then for our country specifically, and for other countries, we have to recreate those past eras where we enhance those relationships and strategic partnerships between different stakeholders, between academic leaders, educational leaders, unions, the faith community, civil rights organizations, and other stakeholders. That's when we have been the most successful in change and the most successful in educational change. And then finally, I have to talk a little bit. I mean, so often academics, we're the first to call for change and the last to do so. That's the old saying, right? Now, I want to tell you that we take this responsibility to do this work seriously. Our college is built on compassion and respect for all people. We're united in a common cause to strengthen communities in our state and beyond and do transformative work. I'm going to tell you, we have 70 community initiatives in our college, and we have to hold our leaders accountable to that value. We have to tell our department chairs, our deans, our provosts, our presidents, that this work is important. This is how we leave a legacy. And here's an example of just a couple of community initiatives that we have. And I want to talk about two of them really quickly, and then I'll wrap up with a thought. So one, we do trainings for educators around the world. We do it online. And we call it the Professional Learning Series. We do social justice training, social action training. There's quite a bit of stuff, and we typically do this in the summers. During the school year, we'll do this for educators, for teachers, principals, etc. So we directly engage our knowledge into communities. Now, it's not often that community members can take a class from a professor. I've taught classes in the summer where anybody in the community can enroll in that class for $100. It's very inexpensive. It's not the $600 or credit that we typically charge. And then that way, we're directly connected to communities. And then finally, we're collaborating with our nation's largest and oldest civil and human rights organizations, the NAACP. And it's the first ever initiative between the NAACP and a higher education institution. Again, if you're going to talk the talk, you have to walk the walk. I think it's important that we hold our leaders accountable, that they must move beyond words into actions. In the United States, we often say, show me the receipts, right? You know, after you go to a store, you purchase something, you accomplish that, you have a receipt. Show me the receipt. So this is the work that we're doing around Breonna Taylor. I don't know if you know about her murder, but that happened here in Kentucky. So teens have been dramatically impacted by that. So we've done work with that. We've done work about coronavirus impacts on historically marginalized students. There's a variety of work that we're doing in civil and human rights across the nation. And then finally, while this meme is a little bit American-centric, I want to apologize for that, but I think this is for Brazilians, Chileans, for Ecuadorians, for everyone, South Africans. Education empowers us as seekers and speakers of truth. We must retain democratic control of our schools to protect the intellectual compass of our democracy. And we do that by demanding dialogic leadership, by ensuring that we are public scholars and that our work is relevant and engaged in communities. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Healy, and congratulations for the wonderful talk. It's very interesting to know your perspective, and we always have some stereotypes from other researchers that are not close to us. So it's really a pleasure to know your positions, to know your perspectives. And we are going to follow you on the media, social media and blogs and so on, because really, it's really very nice it was really very nice to listen to you. And we understand that we fight for the same positions to change the world that we take part, and to make this change through education, that we understand that is the only way to change the world that we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And after all the talks, we can discuss, and we can have questions. So the guys that are listening to us on the YouTube can make questions. I will check there the questions for the end. Okay. So now I will introduce Dr. Just let me find here. Dr. Lekete Makalela, that is from South Africa. So Dr. Makalela is a professor of language and literacy education and founding director of the Hub for Multilingual Education and Literacies at the University of VIII. The real name, all the name is a little bit difficult, but I think it's Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. His research area is on the translanguaging, where he questions the validity of boundaries between language and offer alternatives pathways for learning and teaching in multilingual contexts. He has developed a framework that builds on the cultural competence of infinite relations of dependency. He works with teacher education, lectures, and community stakeholders to effect system-wide change. He has established a literacy foundation which transforms literacy in schools and communities through tailor-made community programs. He has editing, life skills coaching, translation, research experiences that spans over years of his career as a professor and consultant. And today, Dr. Makalela is going to talk about translanguaging as a tool for critical education in the 21st century. So, welcome, Dr. Makalela, and it's really a pleasure to have you here. And please talk to us. The microphone, just the microphone. The presentation, it's okay.
Okay, you hear me now. Okay. Thank you so much. It's my honor and privilege to be invited to participate in this amazing webinar. What I'll be talking to you today, taking over from Julian's important work on the US and the inequalities and democratization of our schools in the globe, in the world. I want to talk about translanguaging as a tool for critical education in our 21st century. And the part of the talk is to reimagine multilingualism, and I'm going to define what that means. Global South, geographically, yes, in the Southern Hemisphere, but this concept is evolving, that it really means all kinds of marginalization, even if you are in the UK, the US, anywhere in the West, as long as you're part of the marginalized communities, Global South is a concept that encapsulates all of that. Now, when we speak about multilingualism, I'll focus a little bit more on Africa or South Africa, but Africa in general. There was a British historian here called Trevor Roper. Is that perhaps in the future there will be some African history, but at present, that is in the 1963s, there is none. There was none then, and in fact, there is none. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. This is about landscape, presence of what you call the African consciousness, being an African in Africa, which is a ecosystem that many Africans do not inhabit. Ngugi Thiong'o reminds us that people without history or culture become mimics who have placed their memories in a psychic tomb. And spoken by Mbeki, former president of South Africa, who was championing the African Renaissance, quoted here by Khosa, says we have to meet prevailing global challenges from within our worldview and proceed to action from our own authentic possibilities based on, I underline, culture and competencies of African themselves. And Africans themselves here would broadly mean, all people in the Global South, basically, their competencies. I had the privilege to live in New York and Johannesburg, and I noticed two types of multilingualism. In New York, there's thousands and thousands of languages there. And, people have their earphones and they're speaking basically in tongues. But the difference between that type of multilingualism and the multilingualism in Johannesburg is that in Johannesburg, it is far more horizontal, rather. People are speaking with each other in more than one language at the same time. In New York, if you speak Irish or if you speak Japanese, you're probably speaking to another Japanese speaker, probably maybe not in the immediate space. Even if you are in a coffee shop or something, it's probably between speakers of the same language. So I refer to that as vertical multilingualism, whereas the Johannesburg one that crosses over, the overlapping one, is a horizontal, rather, multilingualism. What is the issue? The issue is that the whole monolingual and epistemic biases are a pandemic, I think far much greater than most of the pandemics that the world is facing today, against what you call human development broadly or sustainable development in the world. How do we know that? Multilingual learners, students are disadvantaged, marginalized, in basic two ways, what you call educational foci, epistemic access and sense of self or identity affirmations that are cautioned through our systems. And this is against everything that we know about the UN's developmental goals, and Africa 2063 is about the Africa we want, and South Africa has got what we call the National Development Plan. All of them converge on quality education. Yet it doesn't seem like it is truly understood what quality education means. For me, and maybe for other scholars in the field, it means really to know and to be. It's about your access to knowledge, and it's making sense of the world around you and making sense of who you are. To know and to become yourself. The ancient classic philosopher said those who master the curriculum master themselves. And what that means is you grow within the remit of who you are. And education and the curriculum should be about that. It's growing from within and not being trained to develop anything that is happening external to you. Is not education. Now, why critical education is impossible, or education is impossible without language, is that language is the mediator. It mediates this epistemic access, and it also mediates this sense making of who you are. So without language, and here I'll talk about not just language in the sense that we understand it, but what language represents, a particular pathway of coming to know. Your education becomes imitative and not deep learning. And this is the case for many African countries and people in the developing world generally, that education tends to be training, tends to be imitation. It doesn't really get to deeper digestion of thought, of knowledge. And we also know this from literacy work. Work in sub-Saharan Africa shows that there's a grade 4 slump and the Matthew effect. That means the weaker are getting weaker and weaker over time. From grade 1, as you can see, they seem to come to school slightly smarter, but as they go through the education system, the train is going down, and you see a great slump here between grade 3 and grade 4. And from that point onward, it cannot be resolved. It cannot be arrested. It cannot be resolved without serious interventions there. Paul Freire, I'll also quote Freire, spoke about unauthentic forms of existence and thought. When they go to high school and to university, they're seriously damaged because their existence is cautioned, and their cognition is also unauthentic because they don't reach to highest levels of meaning making. That is why the results everywhere in sub-Saharan Africa is going down in that path, in that way. So this is a de-education, miseducation, and not education as we should understand it as self-knowledge and growing from the remit of who you are, as well as having full access to knowledge. What happened was modernization, westernization has meant that there is this oneness ideology that was adopted, that multilingualism is conceived globally today as multiple monolingualism. But that is a particular point of view. Languages existing in boxes and they don't relate with each other. Literacy as literacy, basically there's whole drilling, skilling, and killing, and no concern whatsoever on meaning-based literacy as meaning-based social practice. That means the reading and writing as props for an actual social activity, which is why we want to teach children how to decode, and before they comprehend, they learn to read, and therefore read to learn later on. Writing also is mainly about transcription, and composition is far much delayed, hence that grade 4 slump. For many spaces in Africa, there's a big copying, the versioning from English to African languages, therefore teaching and miseducation in African languages. There's still a huge belief that using more than one language creates mental confusion. This is a mistake it was a mistaken belief coming from the European Renaissance, misunderstood. And as a result, we could be talking about multiculturalism, multilingual education, but in essence, the practice on the ground is heavily and essentially monolingual. One ideology, as I said, comes from the European nation-statism, one nation, one language. The US, of course, the melting pot. For Africa, one language unites us all. We need a uniting language. Therefore, it went to the classroom too, one classroom, one language, because that is part of the understanding. I've already spoken about the contamination, multilingualism as a disease that needs to be eradicated. And monolingualism and how it came to be in Africa and many parts of the world. There are two main frameworks that define the education systems broadly. One is cognitive efficiency mechanism, the belief system that the brain has got two parts. One is the lower part of the brain. You need to itemize and automate lower level thinking skills. And then from there, you go to the much higher working memory, deliberate, more logical stuff, which is why you must begin with the letters and go in that stakes, patch up in that way, because somehow our minds is believed cannot multitask. And then if that doesn't work, which is the case, it's not working globally, that is not the cognitive efficiency, is about the cognitive quality. The environmental opportunity hypothesis becomes a second framework, which is give children or teachers more books, give them more time, add more books, add more subjects, add more, believe that more is better. And then my contention is if something is fundamentally flawed, no matter how much of it you add, in fact, as you add, you're continuing to cut it out, you're continuing to disadvantage the disadvantage, because we are not dealing with issues of episteme, we're not dealing with issues of access and knowledge pathways and ways of knowing and ways of becoming that are indigenous or local to the communities. Well, I'll skip on this one. This is the working memory model that has been pushed throughout the world, really. I was just showing how the mind is having two slave systems, the visual sketch PET and the phonological loop controlled by the executive function. Mainly everything's about cognition, it's about the mental stimulation, and we don't educate the individual holistically. Because of this, and how do we resolve? There are some possibilities today in the 21st century with the modernization having failed, resulting in the Second World War. There had been a shift or a move in thinking, and one of those thinking is to think about languages, this very tool that you need as a foundation for education, that we can gravitate from fixity to fluidity in tandem with the way in which people think, not what people do with the language and not what the languages look like. That's a big epistemological shift. That means boundaries between languages need to be cautioned, because in the head space of an individual who knows more than one language, those boundaries don't actually exist. They are artificial. Languages also not being seen as systems that are placed in boxes, and literacies not as just autonomous skills, literacies, as I spoke about before. We account for input and output in more than one language when you make meaning. Therefore, ideas such as mother tongue, first language, second language, or stable diglossia do not matter anymore in this century where many kids are exposed. In fact, it's part of their ways of being, where they know more than one language even before their age 6. Therefore, they don't have a mother tongue, they have a repertoire, they have a blended way in which they make sense of themselves and make sense of the world out there. However, our education systems are still very much fixed. This is what they call the multilingual turn or the translanguaging, where you talk about linguistic repertoires, using languages simultaneously, not serially. And research has been going on all over the world. I think one of the spaces of change about language is about translanguaging today, where the input and output exchange as an idea. You have an input in one language, output in the other, but it has become far much more complex, what we call Ubuntu complexity today, where we look at, predating. If you want to go pre-colonial Africa, then we need to look at language use before colonization. Okay, so what translanguaging research shows broadly is that there is epistemological rupture and the positive identity affirmation. Using more than one language at the same time is absolutely amazing and has been amazing in different parts of the world. So what is the role of multilingualism? When languages are overlapping, there are no boundaries between them. This is what I refer to as horizontal multilingualism. That is very critical for critical education, and I'll show a few things in here, but the talk about translanguaging always is paradox. How do you talk about languages, but at the same time not recognize languages? Coincidental, I'm also citing Noam Chomsky from linguistic point of view, the I language, the language that is internal to the speaker, versus the E language, or what is called socially named languages. So much so that when you talk about meaning making, it's possible to talk about English, Spanish, Portuguese, isiZulu, isiXhosa. Those are socially named languages, but when speakers are engaged in meaning making, they don't make those boundaries. So one version is about the hearer's problem, thinking I'm speaking lots of languages, but as the speaker, I'm not even conscious oftentimes that I use this. So you have this simultaneous existence of chaos and order in terms of multilinguality. And it has become normal as part of the 21st century feature in the linguistics domain. How do we know this? Is there a template, or is the 21st century giving us something completely new? From the Ghanaian bird, what we call sankofa, you go back to fetch. That's the method of going back to fetch. As you can see, the bird is stretching forward, but the head is going backward to fetch. It's not going to stay in the past. It's moving forward with the knowledge base that is in the past. So this type of multilingualism proposed under translanguaging can be tracked backwards before colonization in Africa. Therefore, we call that the cultural competence. Similarly, many communities have got lots of practices that can be tracked past into the past before modernization, and there's still a lot of evidence of how that can be used for educational reform. If you are in South Africa between Botswana, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Botswana, there's an ancient city of Mapungwe. There is this saying in many African languages: stranger, come to my place, so I am complete. And compare this with the Romans. If you are in Rome, you do what the Romans do. So this is where the Ubuntu, I am because you are, I am in an infinite relations of dependency with you, which you see in terms of the languages. So that's the thing that we draw from the past to say, by the way, this is a competence of the people. Languages overlapping. No one language is complete without the other. Even though I might be using one language as you seem to think as the hearer now, but essentially is a repertoire because I'm drawing from inside of me a number of languages, but conveniently you hear just English now. So other strangers, other languages have come in my place, and I'm complete with all these languages. That's the multilingual talk. So because of that, we draw on this, we walk to schools, and then we work with the teachers to re-conscientize them about the possibilities of using more than one language, because that is a competence that is cultural. Here is some of the schools. I'm giving one example in remote rural areas in South Africa where the university, my hub, we go in there and we do this amazing work. in-service teachers. We do research not on the communities, because we want to draw from lessons of the past. Therefore, we have to engage some of these grannies, as you can see, researching with the community, community-based participatory action research. Classroom support, I'll skip this part of all. We take visitors to school from the United States, elsewhere as they come. But really what this is about is what is an epistemological rupture, where we try to transform schooling through the use of more than one language. We refer to that as Ubuntu translanguaging. We see excellent, amazing results before the intervention. You don't even call this intervention, but working with the communities, that the results are beginning to improve in that informal way. Here's an example of what agency in the classroom. What you see here at these walls is chaos, lots of books rewritten and read in different languages at this corner, and it becomes the children's focal point. It mirrors what is happening in their mental spaces, but also the nature of who they are. That is brought from outside of the classroom and drawn from the logic of the past, how it was before colonization, and it is part of their schooling today, and that's why we are seeing a lot of results. This is the model. Because of that, then we had to theorize educationally that the whole idea of continuation. In other words, we disrupt the order, we disrupt monolingualism, but at the same time, we proceed with cohesion. It's disruption of order, disruption of chaos, rather disruption of order, that's the chaos, and then recreation of new ones, which is the cohesion. But here, the real point here is the I am because we are. I am incomplete without you, and you are incomplete without me. So from language, what the pedagogy, simultaneous learning and teacher, we also reverse the story of a learner and a teacher. So the teachers are coming to the classroom to learn. All learning. Classroom is about learning and it's not about teaching. So these are a series of activities that will resonate with what is called talk, tend and talk in other contexts. But here is hearing from your neighbors, what you call the collective, and so on and so on. But one of the things in writing, for example, is that you can write a text in multiple languages or any language, any resource that you have, if you follow something called process writing. Within, between sentences, paragraphs, and reading those that really create that type of chaos that is needed, because that mirrors how meaning making is made in the mind of a multilingual child. I'm going to quote Baker as I go for closing. Deeper learning and not simple copying. And this is a foundational quote in this work. It is possible in a monolingual teaching situation for students to answer questions or write an essay about a subject without fully understanding it. Processing for meaning may not have occurred, and we know that for sure. Whole sentences or paragraphs can be copied or adapted out of a textbook, from the internet, or from dictation by the teacher without real understanding. It's less easy to do this with translanguaging, to read and discuss a topic in one language and then to write about it in another language means that the subject matter has to be processed and digested. And here we talk about deeper digestion. And anything less than this, many of our students are going through the education system without full digestion of the content. It's indigestion. Here the issues as I close: monolingual or colonial education system increase inequalities and marginalizes the majority of learners, students, and teachers. Epistemic biases undermine indigenous ways of knowing, acting, and being, and of course, all what you call quality education, sustainable development goals. Alternative theories and methodologies based on cultural competence of the local people themselves, what Julius Nyerere spoke about as education for self-reliance. Ubuntu translanguaging as a Southern theory here offers tools for affirmation of identity positions and for epistemic rupture through what you call horizontal multilingualism or multilingual multilingualism. In conclusion, I pointed out that current education policies are a carryover effect of colonial systems. Therefore, there's a need for transformation. There's a need to gravitate from cultural violence, what I've been talking about as cultural violence, if the system is not aligned to your way of being, and epistemicide, what Hassan Ndlovu has been teaching us, killing off the pathway of coming to know, how you come to know. Multilingualism anchors quality education and social justice. There's a need for large-scale advocacy on the value of decolonized and critical education for sustainable development. And here I'll pause. Thank you so much.
We thank you, Dr. Makalela, and congratulations for this amazing talk. And really the experience is motivating, and I think it provokes us to think about our reality here and the possibilities to create projects based on yours. Congratulations a lot. And of course, we are going to talk after Kleber's talk, right? Okay. And the guys on YouTube, we are waiting for your questions. We have some comments. I will. The people are enjoying the talks. In fact, we have some comments. They are saying that they are learning a lot, and we want to discuss after Kleber's talk a little bit more about the subjects. So I will introduce our last presenter, our friend that is from Brazil. This is important that he is here representing our country, our researchers, our studies in the area of critical education. And Kleber is also, I call him a friend because he is very close to UPF, and we have some projects together. And we have a group study here to study the teaching of Portuguese as a foreign language, as and other possibilities as L2 and all the possibilities, international language, and so on. So Dr. Kleber Aparecido Silva holds a PhD in language studies from the State University of São Paulo, a master's degree in applied linguistics from the University of Campinas, and a bachelor's degree in English language from Federal University of Ouro Preto. He carried out postdoctoral studies in the Department of Applied Linguistics at the University of Campinas, postdoctoral studies in the Institute of Applied Linguistics and Language Studies at Catholic University of São Paulo, postdoctoral studies in linguistics in the Language Institute at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, and also a postdoctoral studies in applied linguistics in College of Liberal Arts at the Pennsylvania State University in the USA. He is currently pursuing postdoctoral studies at Federal University of Minas Gerais, in language didactics at the University of Geneva, Switzerland, and in multilingual education and literacy at the University of VIII, South Africa. He was visiting scholar. He was a visiting scholar at the Department of Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese at Penn State University, the State College in Pennsylvania, by Fulbright. And in 2020, he was approved as in the position of distinguished visiting scholar at the Advanced Research Collaborative of the Graduate Center at the University, the City University of New York. He is currently working at the University of Brasília, here in Brazil, as an associate professor and researcher in the Department of Linguistics of the Institute of Language Studies. His main field of interests is in the broad area of language, decoloniality, and teacher education, which also includes gender, race, and linguistics education, race and coloniality, language discourse and identity practices, multiliteracy and critical education of language teachers, critical theories and pedagogies of decolonial practices in the production of knowledge. And he coordinates the CNPq or CNPq certified research group of critical and advanced language studies, and take part in the national literacy research projects and language teacher education in the South America and African studies, whose research interests connect with the studies on language, culture, education, and technology. He also coordinates the Directorate of Language, Human Rights, and Diversities of the Foundation of Scientific and Technological Enterprises of University of Brasília. So here is Kleber, and I have to thank you very much to be here, and also to bring Dr. Macalela to talk to us too. So two thanks.
Well, before to start my lecture, I'd like to thank you, Luciane Sturm, for this invitation. It's an honor for me, to participate in this event with Dr. Julie and Dr. Lekete Macalela. I really appreciated the presentation of them. I'd like I'd like to congrats you, Luciane Sturm, for this event. I'm sure that your attitude, your trajectory in applied linguistics inspired me like a research in Brazil. Thank you for exist in my life and to develop academic project together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'd like to share my screen. I try to do it here. Yep. It is okay.
It's working.
Yep.
It's working.
It's
yes.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to start my presentation from the aquarium to the open sea, critical perspective in the education of Portuguese teachers in Brazil. My name is Kleber. I'm from Brazil. I'm so happy because today I started the interaction with Professor Lekete Macalela. He's my supervisor in my post-PhD in the University of VIII. And today I'd like to talk about from the aquarium to the open sea. Well, I'd like to start my presentation to talk about Brasília, because when you talk about Brasília, it is complicated, isn't it? Because unfortunately, in this city, there is a lot of people don't think about the language policies, but I have not a good behavior like a politician here. But in this city, you have University of Brasília, I develop research in this university, and I intend, to share some result about this project that I developed at the University of Brasilia. Well, I'd like to start my presentation I really appreciated this part of the book of Antonieta Celani. The purpose of teacher education is not to reduce uncertainty by means of the roads indicated by the old maps, but rather to encourage an attitude of researching even outside the maps, so that it's possible to find a place to research for. It's not in any map, the through place whose search always lead us forward and upwards are in our capacity to create them within ourselves, and especially to make them make sense to our students. Well, I consider this so important to try to reduce or to try to develop research, not research to put our results in the library, for example, but you need to rethink about the impact of a research in our society. Well, in this presentation, I'd like to talk about the story of language teaching in Brazil. And after, I'd like to focus on what is the challenge to overcome. And I'd like to reflect about what is missing. And the end of my presentation, I'd like to share some implication, and I conclude some questions to rethinking about it. Well, the story of language teaching in Brazil is so interesting because many teachers consider that experience as incident. You don't consider the experience of the students, don't rescue about the history of the students. But in my point of view, it's necessary to have a holistic view of language teaching and learning. Well, I'm sure that it is so important to talk about where am I talking about it. Well, many of researchers or many colleagues and friends in this audience know that I'm a critical applied linguistics. But what it is critical applied linguistics in Brazilian context, and what do critical applied linguistics in Brazilian context? Well, and according to Boita Lopes, critical applied linguistic or applied linguistic or decolonial applied linguistic, there is some characteristics. It's hybrid, interdisciplinary, transversal, mixed. You have this characteristic with a politics philosophy. Well, in my point of view, critical applied linguistics in the Global South is not the only field of research study for the application of the linguistic theories. You have some characteristics. There is interdisciplinary, transversal, hybrid, and mixed research field. Well, of course that in our society, many topics it is so important. It is important, for example, to rescue or to valorize, to promote the education of children, the rights of less fortunate, the stable balance of culture and language, the flex of technology on communication. In accordance to Cook, there is a many voice speaking to applied linguistics. You have to listen to all of them and speak with your own voice. I consider that this so important in our society. It is important to rescue the voice of the people in our society, a deaf person, a Black, indigenous, and a homeless. All this community is necessary to listen the voice of this community. So important. I consider this fundamental in the critical applied linguistics. Well, Pessoa, Rosane Rocha Pessoa, it is my friend from Federal University of Goiás. She characterized critical applied linguistics like a constant relationship between thought, desire, and action. Of course, that the critical theories, the feminist, post-colonialism, post-structuralism, and anti-racism pedagogy, it is important, to transform our social inequality in our context in Brazil. Marconi and Mihoff question the very concept of language in Africa and to talk about the relationship with the language and shared identity. And when you compare this with Brazil, you need, to modify our conception about the language policies, because here in our context, consider that you have a colonial mind. Lekete Makalela wrote one book now. I really appreciated this book to talk about change the mind. That in our context, I consider that so important, to modify our conception about language policies in Brazil. Well, in Rajagopalan 2015 wrote, when you talk about language policies and language policies in Brazil, it is a diffuse and a confused concept in Brazil. It's so diffuse and confused. Now, I'd like to reflect about some question. Well, the number one, what are the language policy makers? Who are the language policy makers in Brazil? Who are decisions made on language teacher education policies in Brazil? What's the role of the citizen in the elaboration of these policies? How do you build policies based on the engagement of different social groups in the discussion of this to be a privilege or not? Well, in other words, what's the conception about the language policies in our context? Well, unfortunately, in our context, the concept, it is the top-down, it's not the bottom-up. Well, when you develop the research in the critical linguistics, you consider that so important to rescue or to valorize, to listen the voice of the minority in our community. Well, of course, that I defend the bottom-up, but in our context, you have language policies in top-down. But why that I defend this position that's so important to rescue button up, not a thumb down? Because in according to Laura Micoli from University of Minas Gerais, experience of the students in the professors, the teachers in this case, it is so important in our concept to build a language policies. Well, the students' experience, it is so important. It is a phenomenological approach, data analysis, and the teacher experience, it is so important. And according to Micoli, 2010, classroom experience, it is so important when you focus on the direct experience and the indirect experience. And the direct experience involve cognitive or pedagogical experience, a social facts, and affective too. In the indirect experience, you need to consider the contextual, personal, conceptual, and the future. All things based with the collective and the individual. That is considered so important to build some language policy with this diagram. But according to Micoli, you need to focus on the challenging classroom, the challenging teacher, and the student challenger. When you have the challenge of foreign classroom language teaching, learning, probably you have another conception of language policies Brazil. Well, in my point of view, the teachers in the language teachers in Brazil should be like this photo, this picture from Escher, Bond of Union. You don't know who are the teacher, who are the students. Both of them to build the identity, to build the language in linguistic technology, and so on. But now, I'd like to share one history with you. Once upon a time, in our context in the Brazil, language teaching, in a book that was closed on the table. And the words what's made it from that book were control, conditional, assimilation, repetition, imitation, overvaluation of form in foreign language or foreign culture. And then we decided that language is communication. And everyone communicated in Portuguese class English class, German, Spanish, and so on. And in our context, many people consider that when a person, to verbalize, my name is tanana, or what's your name, or how are you, or something like that, the people speak in English. Or language in this context, it is the communication. And we teachers must be creative, patient, dynamic, friendly, experienced, and competent, and in other words, a kind of Superman or a superwoman. And we, the teachers, wait so. When you, the teacher, wait so. Studious, responsible, cooperative, participative, educate, disciplined, and in other words, many superheroes. The question is this that I'd like to share with you, the audience. The books in our context, it is still on the table. There is a mismatch. Now, in our society, when we have the technology, the e-book is on the tablet. Now, we're going to defend. There is no way to separate the language and culture. The cultural integration should be part of language teaching, broadening students' horizon and world views. That the teacher should prepare students to be citizens of the world, critical and aware. Now, in our context, we have a language teacher education for a diverse context, bilingual education in border context, bilingual education for prestigious language, bilingual education in immigrants context, bilingual education for the deaf community, and indigenous bilingual education. You valorize this kind of bilingual education in our context. This with a critical perspective or the colonial perspective. In the context that I developed research at University of Brasilia, it is the education for teachers of Portuguese as second language. Teaching Portuguese for the Black people in Brazil, quilombolas, and the immigrants in crisis in our context, a deaf person, indigenous. In my point of view, when you develop research in public school in Brazil, we arbor our language teaching. In another word, thinking pumpkin versus bouncing pumpkin. Or you have a kind of avacalization. Many citizens of Brazil, when you have the opportunity, to watch this movie, Slumdog Millionaire, think or thought that this movie represent Indian culture, Indian language, but it's not true. Now you have a vocalization in Brazil. Now you have a carnavalization or carnavalized language teaching. Many citizens consider this is a carnival in Brazil, but it's not a carnival. It is that one kind of carnival in Brazil. The question is this. Now you have in our context, you defend the theories in the epistemology, in the ontology of the language policies to promote the language, but the language in Brazil, it is a vocalization or carnavalization and so on. But when you have language teachers education, language teachers in Brazil, you hope that the profiles of the language teacher in Brazil, it is a professional, reflective, communicational, and now all of them is a critical professional. My question is based on in the Baltimore, Valkyria Baltimore from University of São Paulo. It is this: what is the critical? It is important to be critical. It is everyone critical. Do you identify yourself as a critical person? What's some evidence of the criticism in a person's social practice in the pace of teacher and the language learning? It's a good question, isn't it? Just think about what's the critical. Valkyria Baltimore presents some characteristic that is a critical person like the one who you have this characteristic here. Tries to go on beyond the direction given by the author of the text and reflecting the presented concept makes sense. Listen attentive to the different discourse, and reflected about instead of judging them, a temperamental or controversial person, or had a position in relation to the problems that face and knows the privilege he has, doesn't keep to herself what she think it's obvious when she expresses an opinion directly or try to impose his ideology or her ideology, the word in the word, cause shows your position on a particular issue without fear on expressing himself. Well, in accordance to Montemore, you have a difference between the criticism and criticize. The criticism is linked to criticism that result from studies and knowledge leading to assessment provided by reputable expert as a critical of art, music, cinema, and theater. And criticize refer to a social perception that's not depend on schooling of dimensional specialization. Now, I'd like to share one question that I consider that so important. Well, in this year, that is so important for us, Paulo Freire. I really appreciated my colleague to defend or to reflect about Paulo Freire, and the dimension of the Freire help us, in our context. Learning to reflect and lead, begin with yourself, remaking the school culture, and become a professional. Paulo Freire help us, to teach us better, better teacher, to have a critical language education, and so on. Now, in the last part of my presentation, I'd like just to reflect about some implication that that I have with the result of the investigation that I developed in the University of Brasilia. Social identity and professional identity have to be a part of teacher development course and of continuing education program. Social responsibility is a fancy way of promoting something quite old. Ethical action in our life. Think about others. What's the goal? Well, changing the state of affairs. More respectful relationship in the school, more empowered teachers, more successful uh, classroom. I agree. I agree with this question that Limário de Menezes invited de Montemore to share with us one article in 2014. What it is that in the Paulo Freire land, you academic still advocate for critical education? Having had all of the Freudian theories and reflection, having you implement them in our educational programs already? This question is so interesting. What's the path in the education of language teachers to follow for South America in the face of rapid changes that the world has been suffering during recent time? Unfortunately, colleagues, we are in crisis in Brazil, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Bolivia, in Chile, in Venezuela, in Paraguay, in Uruguay, in Argentina. In our context in Brazil, unfortunately, we live in our country that have two characteristics: disorder and presidents don't valorize the progress in the scientific investigation, for example. Now, I'd like to finish my presentation to reflect, to share two reflection about this. The number one, the important thing that is not forget that ultimately our students need to acquire mastery of the foreign language for their own good and to become more able to meet the new challenge that the world poses on their way. They're the ones who have to learn to master the English language, never letting the English language begin to master them. I'd like to speak in English, not the person to say, Kleber, you American or you South African. No. I'd like to speak in English when a person say, oh, you're Brazilian, and you speak in the language of them to explain what my point of view like a Brazilian. You need to modify our mind, our colonial mind with have a decolonial mind. And of course, that I'd like to share my presentation to talk about my master, the scholar inspired us in Brazil. And I have this excerpt of the book of them in Portuguese because it's the language of him. And after, I'd like to finish this in English. Extents, because it is human, cannot be mute, silent, not can be is nourished by false words, but by through words within which man transform the word. To exist homily is not pronounce the word, is not to modify it. The pronounced word, in turn, turns again problemized the pronounced subject to demand from him a new pronunciation. It's not in silence that men are made, but the word, in work, in action, and reflection. Well, I'd like to finish now my presentation. I'd like to well, well, um, I intend, just to reflect about this. In our society, in Brazilian context, it's necessary to rethink about what our conception about language policies. Unfortunately, we live in crisis in Brazil. We are here in the difficult situation this time. But one characteristic that you have, like a Brazilian, it is the hope and hope like Paulo Freire pedagogy. Paulo Freire, in my point of view, Luciani, Professor Julian, Professor Lequete Macalela, inspired us like researchers and like a citizen in Brazil. Because in a point of him, the Brazilian have one characteristic, it is the autonomy. For him, Brazilian suffer a lot, have opposite. But now, what's the characteristic that identify like a Brazilian? It is the hope. And am I sure that the event like this, Luciani's term organized, it is the way to strengthen our hope and to rethink about the language policies in our context. Luciani, thank you for this invitation, and I'd like to to continue to interact with you. And I really appreciated the Professor Julie, Professor Lequete Macalela, and I'm sure that in the end of this event, you continue to to materialize some project together, because when you together, you become more strength. Thank you.
Thank you, Kleber, very much for this amazing talk too. That was very provocative for us. And I think you could close our web conference with important reflections. And we could see that we have we could say different perspectives, but all the perspectives are converging to something that is very important, that is to practice the critical development of thoughts, to have the change that we need. All the countries are facing difficulties, and we know that in Brazil, perhaps we have some reinforcement in these difficulties, unfortunately. But we think that we need this hope that Paulo Freire always mentioned, and we need to fight, because I always say that to be a professor, to be a teacher nowadays, to be an educator has been being a fighter, to be fighting to resist against the people that don't believe in science, that don't believe in teachers, that don't believe in the universities. that we know without education, without universities, without professors, without teachers, we are not going to have any change, and we are not going to have social equality and in all areas. So thank you all for this talks. And we have some minutes to discuss a little bit. And the people that we have more than 100 people watching us. We had almost 140, and now I think we have more than 100 yet. And that is very, very good for us, because something that this talk, this web conference provoked is the necessity or the needs to study other languages, to study, as you mentioned, Kleber, to study English, to be possible to share our points of view with different people around the world. And at University of Passo Fundo, we are building a linguistic policy that understands that all languages can be learned, and we have a space for this translanguaging education. We have immigrants around us. We had in the past the Italians and the Germans and the Polish, and now we have another wave. I don't know if we say this, another moment of this immigration here in our area. And I think we have to think as the richness and the power of these opportunities to interact and to learn and to teach with other people, with other cultures. And this is what the University of Passo Fundo wants to provoke. The students study other languages and learn on other languages to be powerful, to fight more for their rights and the people's rights, and can solve the global problems. That is the theme of this event, to find solutions for local and global problems. And without knowing different languages, we think that it's going to be more difficult. So I really appreciated all your talks, and I think we have lots of things in common that we can work together. And people, as I mentioned, people are enjoying the talk. We have lots of congratulations, comments, and compliments for all. I have here some questions by Karen Masukato that she asks for all of you about your opinion considering the role of internet in the global education. If you think, is there a new way to learn, to teach through the technologies? And I think she doesn't mention here, but I think we can connect this question with the moment that we are facing, and considering that without technology, we wouldn't have this moment here. But I think I would like to listen to you, to your opinions.
Do you want me to say something here? Well, again, we wouldn't have this moment if we didn't have this platform. But I don't think that we can count on the internet for all of education. I think that it allows us to do some new things, but I don't think that the isolation that the internet sometimes enables especially for younger students, I think that's a real challenge. I think that coming back to school has been difficult for some students, especially in their interactions with others. So do I think that some hybrid opportunities make sense for younger students? Absolutely. I think in terms of higher education, I think that it's important that we think about the sort of the collaborations that can happen online. The courses that I could take at your university or vice versa are unprecedented now. But I think we have to be careful with sort of the neoliberal push to make education inexpensive for some students by putting everybody online. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of interactions in higher education. I don't know about you, but I learned as much being on campus from my peers and the socialization that occurred as I did from my actual courses. So I think that, obviously I made the argument that, social media and the technological canvas that we have allows us to cross all borders at the speed of light, really. But I also think that this is an and proposition, not an or proposition, right? Or being this or this, and being this in-person education and these opportunities to do additional supplemental developmental academic work. So I just think we need to be careful. There is this neoliberal push to have kids behind screens and lower the cost and lower the cost of universities, and except there's all of that out there. I think we need to be very careful because I think the socialization parts of education, whether they're young children or older children, are so important.
I agree. I completely agree. Please, Makalela.
Okay. Thank you so much. Julian actually made the point that I wouldn't repeat. Internet is great, but it's not a panacea for our educational challenges. So you can still carry through digitization, e-education, all the problems that we have. So it can still encourage more inequalities. We have seen with the COVID situation in Africa that it was not possible, even schools being closed, do this at home, which parents have access to a computer. So still access to that is a challenge. But even more fundamentally, you can see that if e-education or digitization is only about European languages, okay, in our case, indigenous local languages are not brought into the space, then you still see this kind of marginalization even at a very, very high speed. So it could also be very dangerous if it's not balanced out. The communities that we speak about researching with them, and how do we involve them to be part of this new education system. We like technology, it must be there, but it must not be mistaken for being a solution to foundational educational problems, issues about episteme, ways of knowing and how you come to know, because it's not about uniformity, which digitization might push us into that direction. It's never going to be a better place for anybody in the world if we're all like robots. Okay, there has to be diversity, which is great for what we call biocultural diversities, part of our DNA to survive as human beings. So how does technology ensure that there is diversity of that difference is not deficiency? So there's it's not an end on all. I think Julian, I agree with you. It's not an or, either or. It is an and both. So technology without the core foundational educational matters, it doesn't really resolve anything, just accelerate. Thank you.
Let me just dovetail with that really quickly. The last word you used was accelerate. And I think that part of the challenge too with the internet, even for faculty, just think about now you can do Zooms back to back to back. before you would have a little bit of downtime to travel to the next meeting. You got exercise. You weren't sitting in a chair all the time. So it just has accelerated the pace. And I think that's part of the mental health challenges that you see amongst faculty and the burnout that you see. I think that's important. And the other thing I thought was really important that he said too was, before the pandemic, having an iPad or a Google Chromebook, that was really a luxury. But after the pandemic, that was necessary to receive academic instruction. And not only that, the speed of internet at which you had at your home, or, there were people in the United States that would have to go sit outside restaurants that had free internet so their kids, because they couldn't afford high-speed internet. If you have 3 children on Zoom, that your internet's going to lag. So the things that were luxuries before, super high-speed internet, iPads for every kid, there's very few families that had all of those things, and yet now onto this, you're foisting additional inequality because not every district could afford to do that either when students went home, and so many students just were not being educated.
Kleber, do you want to say something?
No, I agree with Julian and Lekechi. I agree. In our context, Julian, I agree perfectly with you too, because when you talk about technology, you need to think about the access of this technology. Unfortunately, in the poor people in Brazil, it is a huge part of the population in our country don't have the access of the technology, don't have a computer, don't have internet, and so on. And another thing that I consider so important, it is to prepare the student to use the technology. It is the digital literacy, in my point of view, it is so crucial in our society. Do you know that it is important to have the structure with this technology, and you have a condition to prepare the student, the teachers, to use this technology by themselves. I consider that so important. I don't know that you agree with me. What do you think?
I agree with all the comments that you made, and I think that we have to think that internet made the difference for us during the pandemic. But of course, it's not the same for children, for teenagers. I see here at home with my son that has been very difficult for him. So I think that as adults, we could manage a little bit, not easier, but we could adapt, or we had to adapt, in fact, because it was something that was demanded for us. And the experience of interacting in the classroom will never change, I think, for the way that human beings learn. And I think another phenomenon that we had with during the pandemic, as in the considering what Julian mentioned, it was the how could I say, the exclusion phenomenon, because not everybody had, and still have, not everybody still has access. We could see this here at UPF. That is not a public university, is a community university, and most of our students study at night and work during the day to pay their studies. And we have lots of social programs, social projects, extension and research projects that they can engage, but they even we offer these possibilities. Some of them need to work, and some of them didn't have notebooks to watch the classes, so we had to make possible for them to give them some notebooks to make possible to watch the classes. So we imagine this in another situation in public schools, that we have more people without possibilities to have computers and to have access. In my family, I have a sister-in-law that has 3 children studying together. They have the internet, but they didn't have 3 notebooks at the same time. So they had to use cell phone, notebook, and so on. So it's not easy for everybody. But the balance of understanding that we are not going to be the same after this pandemic, and the context of education, I think will change. But I hope that the changes need to be for the best, not to just to think about the economical aspects of the teaching, as Julian mentioned. I don't know if you have other, so if you don't have any other comments, I will ask other questions we have here from the audience. Another student, another person, I don't know if she's a student or a teacher, asked, what is the best way to insert ways to develop initiatives so that young people are interested in being politically active? I think everybody can provide opinions.
Could you read the question again? You're asking what's the best way to inspire students to be involved politically? Is that what the question was?
Yes, to be politically active. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it starts with faculty. I think I think part of it is for students to see that our work is making a difference and is impactful. I think that's where it starts. I think so many students feel discouraged that they're, being in academia is disconnected from what's happening in their communities. It doesn't resonate with them necessarily. And so I think showing students how impactful knowledge creation can be in social movements. I think that for me, that's the key piece. So the work that I do is specific to education and public policy. And so I volunteer. I've been volunteering in the civil and human rights movement in the United States for the past 10 years with the NAACP. And students know that. They know that as a faculty member, that my research goes to civil rights organizations to inform what happens at the community level. And so they can draw a straight line from the knowledge creation and work that they're doing to be having an impact in their communities. And then also just talking to students about how they leave a legacy. At 18 and 19 and 20, they're not really thinking about what a legacy looks like. I think as you get older, you start to think about what your legacy looks like. My mother always told me, leave a place better than you found it, is what she would always tell me. And so I think there's equal parts knowledge creation and equal parts inspiration. I think as faculty, we have to be inspirational to our students. And as they see the actions that we take to make a difference in our world, that inspires them. As I think about the professors that were influential in my life, Sylvia Hurtado, who's at UCLA, Linda Darling Hammond, who was at Stanford and started her own think tank, and there's so many others that I could name. Their work and how I saw it making a difference in the world and in communities was inspirational to me. And I think that it's incumbent upon us as faculty to be inspirational to our students.
I completely agree. That's true. Yeah. Any other comments?
And that's why the dean wore a t-shirt and not a suit to the talk today.
Yeah, that's true. Would you like to say something, Kleber?
Luciani, I agree with the Professor Julian. In according to Freire, to teach, it is a politic action, active, when you teach like a Freire pedagogy, of course that you will not worry with the roles of the language, the roles of the society, but you need to act in this society, to transform this society. The question that I consider so important, you need to fight like Marielle Franco, you need to fight like Paulo Freire, you need to transform my society. When we, like teachers and professors, consider our action like a politics action, of course that you can transform our society.
Yeah, I agree, Kleber, with you. And I think sometimes the students say, oh, to transform something in society, professor, is too far from my possibilities. But I always say that it's not the size of the transformation that matters. It's the thing that you do. You can transform something very close to you, something that you think is small, but that is going to make the difference. To take part in the local needs, to try to transform the things that are near you, and this is going to make the difference in the whole world, because we don't have the opportunity to some of course have, but most of the people don't have the opportunity to transform big things. But we need to have this idea or this consciousness that we need to act locally to transform globally. That is going to make the difference. And I think we are, when you should be the inspiration for our students and for the teachers at school needs to be, because some teacher inspired us, and I think that's why we chose this profession to be educators, because we followed some inspirational professors and teachers. And I think we are almost here in Brazil is almost midday, and then I think we can finish. And the conference, to meet you was just wonderful. I enjoyed a lot, and I'm very glad that the people that were watching us enjoyed too, and they say that they learned a lot with you this morning. I learned a lot, and in the name of the University of Passo Fundo, I congratulate you and say thank you very much to be with us. And now I hope that in the near future we can meet here at the university to talk in an auditorium, perhaps together or not together, but you are invited to come to Passo Fundo, to the University of Passo Fundo, and say, I know that Julian is planning to come, and we will be very glad to have you here, Julian. Kleber too, and Macalela too. So, and I have to say that we wish you all the best, and thank you again. Thank you very much. Bye bye. Have a wonderful week.
Well, for you too.
Bye-bye. And
All right,
people
bye-bye.
can check the program of the Knowledge Week. Okay, we have lots of important activities. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.